All right, Pushians, here we go with the Cold War begins. This is the first note set of our last unit for the year. It's Unit 7, and this unit covers basically everything from 1945, which is where we left off last time with the end of World War II, all the way up through the College Board arguably says through modern day or through current day. That's a little intense. So we will get through pretty solidly up through about 1991. 1991 is significant because that is the year when the Cold War ends and when the Soviet Union dissolves and becomes Russia again. So for this whole unit, everything that we talk about in here, we talk about John F. Kennedy and the Civil Rights Movement in Vietnam and like Ronald Reagan. This thing that's going on in the background of all of that is the Cold War. It's going to last from 1945 or 1947, really, all the way up until 1991 when the Soviet Union collapses. So it's a big deal event. It's going on for a really long time. And that's in the background of everything. If you printed these notes offline, you might have noticed that the first part of this, back here, it basically deals with the same exact slides that you saw at the end of the World War II note. So this is just here as a reminder mostly that in the same way kind of that the way we end World War I creates World War II in many ways, so too does the way that we end World War II with this sort of splitting of Europe and our kind of diplomacy with the Soviet Union is a big part of how the Cold War gets going. So a lot of the things that are going to cause the Cold War to start come out of or created out of the end of World War II. So like the United Nations, which is going to feature heavily in the Cold War, the division of Germany, the split between East and West Germany, that's a big like early source of conflict in the early Cold War, etc. Okay? So the Cold War begins, the kind of tensions are ramping up, like I said, 1945, 1946, and then 1947 is kind of when things really start to hit the fan, as it were. So sources of friction, reasons why the United States and the USSR, who have just spent, 4-ish years being pretty profitable allies, are going to decide that the whole allies thing is not for us, and instead we are going to be mortal enemies for like the next 50 years. Reason number one is just our differing ideologies. So we believe very strongly by this point in a capitalistic economy and a democratic government, or a Republican government, however you want to say, as the best way for sort of our country and the world to function. Soviets, on the other hand, of course, are very committed to communism, which is both a political and an economic system. So it's similar to, again, our capitalism and democracy. And both of us think that our system should dominate the globe. So communists want to spread communism worldwide. We want to spread capitalism and democracy worldwide. Another major source of friction, another reason that the Soviet Union's upset with us and we're kind of upset with them, is the disparity of like atomic weapons. The whole point of the Cold War is this issue of balance, right? It's two superpowers, they're in balance, and when they're out of balance, the side that's on like the lower end of the totem pole gets kind of upset. And in this case, it's the USSR, right? We have nuclear weapons, we've exploded bombs on Hiroshima and on Nagasaki, and the Soviet Union really wants them. There's some half-hearted attempts made to avoid like an arms race. Both sides kind of like pull out of that relatively quickly, and so we're going to see about a 15-ish year long arms race where the race to develop the biggest, the best, the deadliest weapons is going to be on pretty much from the end of the war. And then the other big thing that's going on is what I mentioned right at the end of the World War II notes, and that is the division of Europe between Soviet-dominated communist East Europe and the non-Soviet dominated, non-communist Western Europe, which is largely democratic, or at least sort of democratic leaning in many ways. The first kind of like verbal recognition of this conflict that we're going to come to call the Cold War comes actually from former Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who in 1946 is doing what a lot of retired politicians do. He is giving a speech. He's giving a speaking tour. He's in the United States. He's in like somewhere kind of random, like Wisconsin or Missouri. And while he's in the United States, he gives this speech that comes to be called the Iron Curtain speech. And in it, he says that an iron curtain has descended across Europe, dividing sort of communism from non. He's kind of putting like a word or a terminology to a phenomenon that a lot of people already recognize. Iron Curtain is a metaphor for the division between communists East Europe and non-communist West Europe. You need to be careful here because we're going to get to eventually the Berlin Wall, which is an actual physical wall, right? But in this case, Iron Curtain is a metaphor for the division between the two sides of Europe. And I kind of, as I click there, you can see that red line that roughly represents the Iron Curtain itself. Yugoslavia is kind of dashed in because Yugoslavia is communist, but not allied with the Soviet Union. The guy who's the dictator in Yugoslavia does not like Stalin, and they don't get along. So it's communist, but not exactly behind the Iron Curtain, as Churchill would say. If you're having a hard time with the idea of the curtain as like an iron curtain, that sounds kind of weird. Think of it not as like a curtain on a window so much, but more like a stage curtain that can drop sort of all in one, like big fell swoop, like at the end of a theater show or something like that. That's the type of curtain Churchill was trying to evoke. The first movement of the United States towards a Cold War policy is going to be at the behest or at the sort of urging of a kind of a mid-level State Department official. This guy right here, his name is George Kennan, and that's a pretty important name to know. He comes up a lot, and if you see his name, you need to very specifically associate him with a policy called containment. So in 1946-47, Kennan is living abroad. He's a U.S. State Department official in the Soviet Union. He's been living there for like 10 years or so at that point, and he sends back to the Truman administration, it's called the Long Telegram. It was actually literally a very long telegram, and in it he details sort of his observations of the Soviets, of their culture, of their attitude towards the United States, and he makes kind of these three observations down here at the bottom. He says, the Soviet Union already sees itself at war with us. Like, we don't think we're at war, they already think they're at war, and we need to kind of wise up. The Soviet Union's main goal is an aggressive expansion of communism, and that should worry the United States. And so therefore we should pursue this policy, and he's the one who sort of puts the name to it, of containment. Containment is a super, super, super important policy that's going to be at the basis of the U.S. foreign policy for the entire rest of the Cold War. So from here in like 1946-47, all the way until the Soviet Union crumbles in 1991, pretty much everything that we do foreign policy-wise, every war we enter, every foreign policy maneuver we make can be traced back to some version of containment. Each president in the Cold War is going to have their own version of containment. So we're under Truman right now. He's got his thing. We'll go to Eisenhower, right? Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, and then first Bush. George H.W. Bush is president when the Cold War ends. So it's like 9 presidents are each going to put their own spin on containment, but it's going to be at the basis of all of Soviet policy. So the 3 elements that you see up here are kind of at what containment's all about. It's basically what it sounds like. It's to keep communism contained, right, and not allow it to spread. We're not going to directly attack the Soviet Union because, we don't want to start World War III. That sounds like a bad idea to us at this point. But we also don't want it to spread. There's a real similarity here, a real synthesis, if we want to think about the language in the DBQ rubric, between the way that we're viewing containment here in the 20th century and the way that a lot of Northerners viewed slavery in the period before the Civil War. Like, well, we're not going to tell Georgia to stop having slaves, but we're going to try to keep it from spreading to the Western territories, right? Sort of a similar philosophy. Not attack it where it already is, keep it contained, and then figure eventually it will die out. This does work eventually. It's just going to take like a whole lot longer and cost a whole lot more money and lives and etc. than we really think it does in the 1940s. The first real example of containment policy, like the first thing that you can point to in the United States and say, oh, there is us like doing containment, is the Truman Doctrine. Now, you guys should probably have read this as one of those first documents that's in that set of documents that you're reading. And if not, you will read it. So what the Truman Doctrine is, anytime, by the way, that you see like a president name and then doctrine, what you're always looking at is a statement of foreign policy. So we had like the Monroe Doctrine way back. That was a statement of foreign policy from President Monroe. With the Truman Doctrine here, we're going to get like the Eisenhower Doctrine, there's a Bush Doctrine, there's an Obama Doctrine. So if it's a president's name and then doctrine, you're talking foreign policy. That's a good little like clue. So the Truman Doctrine, Statement of Foreign Policy by the Truman administration, and what it says is kind of this last bullet here is the important part on this slide, basically says that the United States will give aid, primarily meaning money, but also meaning like military advisors and things, to any country that needs it to resist like a communist uprising. So if there's a communist uprising in your country and you're in danger of having your government taken over by communism, then the United States will give you money, right, to stop that from happening. It's containment in action. The first two countries where this is going to be applied are Greece, right down here, and then Turkey, right next door. If you take a look at where the Soviet Union is, it's all this sort of dark brown. That's what the Soviet Union controlled in this time period. And so Greece and Turkey are pretty like logical acquisitions in terms of like where would the Soviet Union go next. And the Truman Doctrine is going to successfully help both Greece and Turkey fight off communist revolutions. Neither of those countries becomes communist, although both of them continue to have like sort of internal struggles for a long time after. But so the Truman Doctrine, March of 1947, if you want to take a conservative view of the Cold War, this is really when the Cold War, like you can't say the Cold War starts after this. The Truman Doctrine is very, very much part of the Cold War. Okay. Right after the Truman Doctrine gets underway, we're going to start to finalize the creation of something really big, very important, still very important today, that we have been talking about since the end of World War II, and that is a permanent peacetime military alliance. So this is something the United States has never, ever, ever done before in our entire history as a country. We've never joined a military alliance while we were not at war, right? We've temporarily joined alliances during World War I, et cetera, various other wars that we fought in alliance. But for the most part, after the war was over, then we just sort of, snapped back into being isolationist or being neutral. So NATO which we, form up and sign into in March of 1948, is the first time that the United States has ever joined a permanent peacetime military alliance. It permanently changes our foreign policy, right? As most of you, I think, still know, we're still part of NATO today. It's a fairly big deal, although it's been challenged a little bit recently. And what NATO is it's what's called a collective security alliance. So it's a defensive alliance. All of the countries that are in green are the countries that are in NATO today. Some of them have joined relatively recently, like Spain wasn't part of NATO originally because it was still fascist. But the idea of NATO was that if one country is attacked, so if like Canada is attacked, then what it does is it obligates the other countries that are NATO to come to Canada's like rescue. It's not an offensive alliance. If Canada goes on some sort of muck and starts trying to invade Russia or something like that, it doesn't obligate us to fight with them then. It's only a defensive alliance. It's based on this idea of collective security. The College Board loves this term. It's really, really prominent in the curriculum, so this is definitely one that you need to know. This deserves like a little star in your notes or whatever. So collective security is this idea of a type of alliance that's specifically defensive, formed on the principle that the strongest like way to prevent war is by having a lot of countries that will sort of back each other up. So, nobody wants to go to war with, France, for example, because they know if they do, all of the other NATO member countries will join it. So it's like a defensive alliance, open and above board, not secret like the ones before World War I. And that's very important. So this is NATO. Sometimes it's called the Western Bloc because largely in opposition to what we'll see in a second, which is the Eastern Bloc alliance. In April of 1948, right, at pretty much the exact same time that we're sort of finalizing NATO, the United States also rolls out something else that's a big part of containment, even though it might not look like it on the surface, and that is what's called the Marshall Plan. So the Marshall Plan is named for U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall, and this is a really, really big one. This is quite an important program, and it's basically foreign aid, money from the United States to any country that needs it to recover from World War II. So if you think about all of the bombing and like the physical devastation that World War II left behind, the Marshall Plan allows the United States to loan money to those countries specifically to rebuild. It's massively successful. It basically completely rebuilds Western Europe, say about 1950, 1951. Most of the physical damage from the war is either gone or is sort of being constructed. The strings that are attached to the Marshall Plan basically say that any country that accepts Marshall Plan money has to support U.S. plans for like free elections in Eastern Europe. And so what that means is that Stalin and then all of the other sort of USSR associated countries are not going to accept the money. And so they don't really recover from World War II. Like you could still tour the Soviet Union in like the 1970s and still see damage from World War II in the 1940s. So it takes them a lot longer to recover if they really ever do. The Soviet Union will loan out some money as well, but they just don't have the monetary capacity that we do. So Marshall Plan is a good example of kind of like sneaky containment. It doesn't say anything about communism in it, but if you take a second to think about why us helping like Western Europe recover from the war might help stop the spread of communism, you might come up with the fact that communism is super, super attractive when you're poor, right? When your country is a bombed out rubble, communism sounds great because it's an equalizer, right? It says all of the wealthy and all of the poor people are all the same. There's no class differences, right? It redistributes money. So if we can strengthen our allies and if we can make them like less poor, right, then that makes it less likely that France or Great Britain will have a serious communist threat inside their border. So the Marshall Plan is a containment policy, even though it might not look like it on the surface. Okay. While we are happily negotiating our way into some alliances, the Soviet Union's not sleeping. They're doing the same thing. Their response to NATO is what's going to be called the Warsaw Pact. May of 1955 is when that comes up. Where countries in the Warsaw Pact are usually called Eastern Bloc nations, yes, without the K, I don't know why. And it's basically the Soviet Union and then what we call its satellite countries. This is a term that we use to indicate all of the countries that are controlled by or that sort of orbit around the Soviet Union. So like Kazakhstan, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, like Yugoslavia, right? Those kinds of countries, excuse me, not Yugoslavia, Georgia, Uzbekistan, etc. So if you take a look at this map that's down here, everything that's in blue shaded is NATO, is going to be part of NATO, our Western alliance, and then everything that's like red or pink shaded is going to be part of the Warsaw Pact. So you can see that division again, that's Germany right there. So that's West Germany and East Germany that we talked a little bit about that division. So this slide that's right here, if you've got your printout, this is a good thing for you to have. This sort of sums up the Cold War as a whole, right? We have this conflict between Soviet and Eastern Bloc nations and the U.S. and Western democracies. The Soviets are trying to spread communism. The U.S. is trying to contain communism. And then down here, kind of 1 through 4, this is basically how we're going to do it. If you think, okay, Cold War, somebody out there, I'm sure, is wondering if it's called the Cold War because it's fought in the winter. That's not true, although I get somebody who asks that every year, so no worries. It's called a Cold War because it's not fought directly through quote-unquote hot means, meaning like this U.S., the two combatants up here, the Soviet Union and the United States, never fire directly at each other. Like, we're never going to exchange shots in any sort of meaningful way. We're not going to fire missiles at them. They don't fire missiles at us. Instead, the Cold War is kind of like the type of, when you talk about like being in a fight with somebody, you can mean two things, right? You can mean like you're actively out there, punching them and hitting them, and that would be like a hot war, a war like we normally talk about it. The Cold War version of the fight is like when you and your friends are, in a squabble, and so you're like sitting at separate lunch tables, and everybody's like gossiping about each other and trying to kind of win over, the friend group to see your side of things, and like posting nasty messages on Snapchat about each other. That's the Cold War. That's basically what the Soviet Union and the U.S. are doing. So our methodology is we're going to spend a lot of time spying on each other, trying to find information about what the other is doing. The United States is going to develop the CIA. That's a immediate post-war thing that comes into existence. And the Soviet Union goes through a series of spy agencies. The KGB is the most well-known one, the only one that you might need to recognize by name. We're also going to engage in a series of competitive races. So I already kind of mentioned the arms race, or the escalation over who's got sort of the biggest and the baddest nuclear weaponry. That one's going to go on for about 15 years, and it's going to kind of bleed into the space race, the competition over who has the best space technology. That's going to kick off in 1957 with the launch of Sputnik. We've got competing alliances, and we're going to use those competing alliances to kind of fight for the hearts and minds of the rest of the world. So Europe is fairly well locked down, right, as we'll talk about in just a second here. So the question then becomes who can control Asia, or is Latin America going to become communist, or the Middle East, right? These other parts of the world that we haven't concerned ourselves with too much, except to conquer them occasionally. And so this is how we're going to get led into a series of what we call proxy wars. Proxy war is, the proxy is like when you do something through someone else. So you're not doing it directly yourself, you're using a secondary source. So instead of the Soviet Union fighting the United States, what we're going to do is we're both going to find other conflicts that are going on around the world, and we're each going to support one side to kind of fight out through these other countries' conflicts. So the two biggest proxy wars are the Korean War and then the Vietnam War, right? Both the Korean War and the Vietnam War are part of the overall Cold War struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States. We basically take these conflicts that are already happening in other countries and we kind of impose ourselves into them in a really heavy-handed way, as we will discuss. Okay. The first major conflict of the Cold War, the first time where we have what we would call a battle if this was a war, where the Soviet Union wants something and the United States wants something and we both sort of compete for it, is going to be basically what we're going to call the Berlin Airlift, or the situation in Berlin. So as you may recall, we've got a really dumb situation, right, in Germany, where we have West Germany, that's democratic country, East Germany, that's non-democratic country, it's communist. That's not so dumb. It's a little odd, but it's not beyond redemption. The weird thing is that we've taken the city of Berlin itself, right, and we have subdivided that as well into West Berlin and East Berlin. So inside Soviet East Germany, we have this little tiny half city of West Berlin that is democratic and allied with West Germany. So it's almost like an island city right here. Stalin looks at this in June of 1948 and is like, okay, this is dumb. We should control all of Berlin. It's in our country. And so he's going to decide to set up a blockade around it, right? So it surrounds the city with like tanks and etc., cuts off all of the roads in and out. Why doesn't Stalin just, fire on the Allied troops that are in there? I mean, he's got weapons. The answer to that is the answer to the entirety of the Cold War, which is he doesn't want to start a direct war. So it's this question of like, how close can both sides come? How confrontational can we be without actually firing at each other? The Allies have a couple of options here, right? We can ignore this. We can let the blockade continue. West Berlin will eventually collapse. I mean, it's just half a city, right? We could start a war, right? We could fire. We have weapons. We have soldiers inside West Berlin. We could fire on the Soviet troops that are blockading the city. We don't really want to do that either. So we decide to take kind of a third road. We decide to try to help the city survive the blockade by flying in, over these corridors that we have from West Germany, all of the supplies that the city of West Berlin needs to survive. This is going to go on. We're going to supply this entire city by air for basically almost an entire year, from June of 1948 to May of 1949. Allied air crews are going to fly, as the slide notes, over 200,000 flights, providing everything from milk and food to clothes, medicine, like toilet paper, everything that you could possibly need to keep a city from dying or collapsing on itself for a year. It's sort of a standoff. Who will last longer? Will Stalin keep up the blockade longer until we give up flying things in, or can we fly things in long enough to make Stalin give up the blockade? And it turns out that the end answer is that the Soviets are going to cave first. In May of 1949, the Soviets withdraw their blockade. West Berlin is once again able to sort of resume its normal daily life, and we've sort of won the first victory of the Cold War. So if you want to imagine like a little mental chalkboard, this is like the United States 1, Soviet Union 0. But lest we get too excited about our early victory here in this kind of first skirmish of the Cold War, pretty quickly thereafter, the Soviet Union is going to even the score by exploding their first atomic bomb. I don't have the month up here, but it's like August or so of 1949 that the Soviet Union successfully explodes its first atomic bomb. They've basically stolen atomic secrets from us, as we will discuss a little bit further later on in the note set here. And they're sort of successfully have replicated basically our atomic bomb and detonated one in a test run off the coast of like Siberia. I think they're somewhere up there. So that's not good for us, because now we're in a situation that's sometimes called mad mutually assured destruction. Like they have a gun pointed at us, we have a gun pointed at them. It puts us, sort of both in a bad position. In addition, 1949 is going to turn out overall not to be a great year for the Democratic Party, for Truman, who's in charge of the U.S., because the same year, we just literally spent a year supplying half a city by air to make sure that it didn't fall to communism, and we kind of miss the fall of the largest population in the world to communism. So China has been in a bad situation for a long time, right? Remember that they got invaded, Manchuria got invaded by Japan in 1931, and then the sort of mainland part of China got invaded in 1937, right? That was the rape of Nanjing. And while that was going on, they were also suffering kind of an internal civil war between the growing Communist Party, headed by this guy here, Mao Zedong, and then the the government of China, sort of the U.S.-backed, we have it called nationalist government up here. It's not really a democracy, but it's not communist either, so we're backing it, headed by Chiang Kai-shek. You see a different version of the name there. That's just a different way of transliterating the Chinese character alphabet into like a Western letter alphabet. So Chiang Kai-shek at the head of the Nationalist Party and then Mao Zedong at the head of the Chinese Communist Party. Basically, the way that the revolution goes, you can kind of see like the red arrows up here. It starts, it's like strongest up here, and in the area, the Manchuria area where the Japanese had first invaded. And then in like 1948, the Chinese communists are going to start to gain some more territory here. You can see all these with 48 in them, right? The territory that is sort of gained or fought over in 48. The big prize, of course, is Beijing, the capital city of China then as still today. And in January of 1949, so at the beginning of this year, while the Berlin airlift is going on, the Beijing capital falls. The communists like flood into the city. The nationalists with Chiang Kai-shek flee. They flee out of Beijing. It's like 200,000 or so people, and then they're sort of picking up followers along the way, and they're going to flee off the coast to this island that we call Taiwan today, the island of Taipei, and they're going to set up essentially a competing government out here on Taiwan. It's about 2.5 million nationalists are on the government here. And so in October of 1949, the communists who now control Beijing and most of mainland China are going to proclaim themselves the People's Republic of China, and that's the government that still controls mainland China today. On Taiwan, meanwhile, the last of the nationalist government, headed by Chiang Kai-shek and followers, are going to say, no, we are still the true representative of China. We are the Republic of China, here in exile on Taiwan. And so this sets up a situation that still technically exists today, where you have two separate governments that are basically both claiming to represent the Chinese people or the country of China. And the question for the United States is, which one do we recognize? And if you think about that and containment for a sec, you probably come to the correct conclusion that we're going to recognize Taiwan as China, the government on Taiwan as China, for about the next 30 years, all the way up until the 1970s. This isn't going to change until Richard Nixon. So this is a pretty big deal because this has to do with like who gets to have the seat on the Security Council in the United Nations and etc. So for right now, we're still recognizing Taiwan out here, and then the whole rest of the country is turned communist. So we're trying to save half a city by air, right? But like we let China, the perception anyway, of course, is that we let China slip through our fingers. This is a big black eye for Truman and for the Democrats. The Republican Party immediately roars forward and claims that Democrats are sort of soft on communism and that they weren't paying enough attention. And the Chinese Revolution represents a shift of the Cold War. This is when we kind of realize, like, okay, this is not just a European thing. We don't just need to worry about, fighting little borders and boundaries in Europe. We need to worry about the whole world. And so from here on out, from 1949 onwards, the Cold War really becomes a worldwide struggle in all over Asia, all over Latin America, all over the Middle East, a little bit in Africa as well. This again, struggle over communism and democracy. In the wake of China, we get a little reactionary, as we do sometimes when we suffer what we perceive as a defeat. And we're going to pass this, NSC is the National Security Council, so we're going to pass this like military paper that redefines kind of foreign policy. It's called NSC 68, and it's containment, but it's like extra containment. And it frames the Cold War in really harsh terms as this clash between freedom and slavery, as the slide says. And significantly what it does, like the impact of NSC 68, is it creates a huge boost in peacetime military defense spending. So what you're looking at over here, this is how much the United States government is spending on defense, so on like the military, etc. So you can see here's 1940, right? We go to war, that's Pearl Harbor. There's the predictable giant upward shoot of, military spending. This is like the war case, 1945, the war ends, and this plummets almost right back down, right? So we go all the way back down. This is what we've always done before. After the Civil War, we dismantled our military. After World War I, we dismantled our military. After World War II, we dismantled our military. This is like, Truman, etc. And then right here, what you're seeing right here, this spike, that big upward spike, that is NSC 68. And what you're seeing, and that still continues today, is the sharp rise in military spending that's going to happen during peacetime. This is one of those things that's a really significant difference in the U.S. economy and government after the Cold War. And what that is is that today, and starting in 1950, we spend constantly at a very high rate on our military, whereas we used to only spend a lot during war. So when we used to go to war, it was like a big economic boost, right? Because we had a small military and now we're expanding. But today, when we go to war, which we are at war and we have gone to war relatively recently, it doesn't provide that same boost because we're constantly spending at a very high level, right? So NSC 68 starts that. It's a pretty big deal there in 1950. The guy who writes it is this gentleman down here, Paul Metzger. That is the first section here, sort of talking about the beginning of Cold War policy under Truman. The next section in America under Truman, I'm going to take a quick pause and we'll continue in a second. Okay, so continuing with America under Truman. So a few things, I'm going to click past a couple of these relatively quick. The National Security Act creates a lot of sort of our modern day defense structure. This is when the Air Force and the CIA are both established big deal things, 1947 here. A really big deal thing that the Truman administration does at home right after the war is they're going to start these investigations essentially into like the loyalty of people who work in the government. There's a concern among some in the Truman administration that certain people or certain organizations like within the fabric of American society are subversive or are sort of trying to work to undermine democracy and capitalism like from the inside. There's this question of like, is this enough? Is it too much? It's really going to hit hard labor unions, which have, as you might recall, traditional ties to like more radical elements. It's not uncommon to have the heads of labor unions be people who are in the Communist Party of the United States, etc. And it's also going to we're going to see a big sort of influx of this into various industries in the U.S. government, so like the State Department, etc. And this is the beginning of what we sometimes refer to as the Second Red Scare. So if you cast your mind back to the beginning of last unit, you should remember that right after World War I, we talked about the first Red Scare, and that was like A. Mitchell Palmer and his like houses were being bombed by anarchists, and they rounded up a bunch of immigrants. And the first Red Scare was really, really concerned with immigrants, right? It was these radicals who were coming in from outside, and so we had to pass immigration quota acts, and we had to deport a bunch of these immigrants, etc. The second Red Scare, the one that we're in now right after World War II, focuses a lot more on like essentially American communists or people who are already inside the United States who might be secret, communist operatives or secret communist spies. And it's really going to be driven by a couple of very high profile espionage cases, the two that I have up here. In 1948, Alger Hiss, who was sort of a mid-level State Department official. Remember, our State Department handles foreign affairs. So this is him right here. He's convicted of passing the Soviets military secrets during World War II, at which time we were allies with the Soviet Union, but that still doesn't mean that you can pass them as military secrets. So he's convicted in 1950 of espionage, and that really shocks people. Like, oh, if there's a Soviet spy in the State Department, maybe there's more. And then the other really super, super high profile thing in 1950 is the arrest and then trial of a married couple, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. This is them right here, over here, having a very dramatic jailhouse reunion. What the two of them are, Julius Rosenberg was a person who worked at Los Alamos at the Manhattan Project, right, where we developed nuclear weapons during the war. He wasn't like a top scientist or anything. He was just sort of like a mid-level engineer. And his wife, Ethel Rosenberg, worked from home. She was like a secretary and a typist. And so what they're accused of basically is that he smuggled nuclear secrets out of Los Alamos and that she typed them up and helped hand them off to, I think it was like her brother and a couple of other people in the family who were supposedly involved. Huge high-profile trial. The two of them are very like flamboyant. They're very sort of dramatic. They have two young kids who are like 6 and 8 maybe when they're arrested, something like that, 2 boys. And so the Rosenberg trial and the Alger Hiss trial draw a lot of public attention and really freak a lot of people out or sort of convince a lot of people that there really is a danger of, Soviet spies sort of pervasive inside the United States. So out of that, we get a series of congressional investigations. One part comes out of the House, and another is going to come out of the Senate. So the first one that we're going to talk about here is the part that comes out of the House. So this is HUAC, or the House Un-American Activities Committee. And they're going to, it's a House investigative committee, just like the one that investigated Benghazi here recently, right? And, there's something is wrong and we need to investigate and see what's going on. So they formed up this committee largely to investigate the influence of communism in like daily life in the U.S. And they're going to investigate a bunch of different industries, but famously, they investigate the Hollywood film industry, and they call in before Congress dozens of actors, screenwriters, directors, right, cinematographers, etc., to question them about their ties to the Communist Party, which it's not illegal, right, to be a member of the Communist Party. You can be a member of any political party you want. I mean, you can't, you know, plot to overthrow the U.S. government, right? But you can be a member of a communist party. And so, many people in Hollywood were or had been in the 1930s, right? And so they get called up and they get asked all about their ties and, were they involved and, have they ever tried to, influence the public through film, etc. It doesn't lead to any arrests. Again, it's not illegal to be a communist. And, people don't get thrown in jail or tortured or anything like that. But what does happen is it really ruins a lot of careers. There's a group called the Hollywood 10, mostly actors, a couple screenwriters who get called up, who all refuse to answer. They do what's called plead the fifth, right? They say, I've refused to answer that, etc. And all of them and a bunch of other people who get called up in front of the committee wind up getting blacklisted and are like completely unable to find work. A really good example of this, for impact-wise, is Charlie Chaplin, the famous silent film star, gets hauled up in front of HUAC and also in front of the McCarthy hearings, which we'll see in just a sec here, and winds up leaving the United States and basically spending his sort of like adulthood in Italy, kind of in exile, voluntary exile, but because he largely couldn't get work after having been questioned by HUAC. So the HUAC is the House version. You see this McCarthy down here, and we'll talk about this a little bit further in a bit here, but McCarthyism is the sort of Senate version of this. So both the House and the Senate carry out these investigations, and this is sort of the form that the Red Scare takes, the second one. The College Board really, really, really loves to ask you to compare the first and second Red Scares. So it's very good to know that the first one is focused around immigrants and like nativism and immigration. And the second one is much more focused on the idea of communists sort of embedded in daily life, in Hollywood, in the government, etc. Some other stuff that's going on domestically during the Truman administration. The Taft-Hartley Act is a pretty big deal. It might not seem like it on the face of it, but it is also an expression of the second Red Scare. What it does is it's going to roll back a lot of the Wagner Act. So when we talked about the New Deal, one of the things that I really emphasized and yelled at about a lot was the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act. That's a huge deal piece of legislation that made it possible for people to join unions, and union membership went skyrocketing. So it was 1935, right? It's kind of at the height of the Second New Deal. The Taft-Hartley Act is going to roll back a lot of that, and specifically it's going to do it in a way that's intended to tag like the power of communist labor union leaders. So it's going to require anybody who's an officer at a union, like president or secretary or whatever, to sign a non-communist pledge. It also allows states to pass right-to-work laws, which North Carolina is a right-to-work state right now. And what that means is that you can't essentially, you can't require people to join a union. It weakens unions because it allows people to be sort of like free riders on. So if you can imagine, if you look around at everybody in your class right now, and you imagine that you're trying to form a labor union to get, less work in the class, and if you have the power to force everyone to join the union, then you can have a lot of bargaining power. Whereas, if say maybe only half of you join the labor union, you have to negotiate on behalf of the whole class, but the rest of those lazy bums, they're not doing anything, they're not paying any money in, but they're still getting the benefits from the union. So that's North Carolina, as well as a lot of other kind of more conservative states are right-to-work states right now, and it really weakens the abilities of unions to sort of get anything done. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing is sort of depending on how you feel about unions. So the Taft-Hartley Act is another good expression of this sort of trying to rein in the power of labor unions, which were sort of seen as being kind of communistic in nature or communist leaning. This is mostly what I was just talking about with NNC 68, so you can sort of read this as you will. Maybe this line is probably the most important one on here to note that the Cold War sort of serves as that pump primer, right? During the New Deal, we had the government kind of purposely pumping money into society through programs like the CCC and the WPA. We don't really have to do that anymore because the Cold War is kind of doing it automatically through creating defense jobs, in various ways. A really good example of a major pump primer that comes about in the post-World War II years is the passage of what we call the GI Bill. GI was slang for World War II soldiers, so this is like saying a soldier bill or something like that. And what the GI Bill did was, it's still around today, if you are a veteran, if you're a combat veteran, it gives you money that you can use for one of three things. You can use your GI Bill money after you serve in the military to buy a house. You could use your GI Bill money to go back to school to pay for college. Or you could use your GI Bill money to get like a low interest business loan, basically. And so if you think about it, any one of those three things, whether you're becoming a homeowner, or whether you are becoming a college grad, or whether you're becoming a business owner, whichever one of those three things you use the money for, all of those are basically hallmarks of the middle class. And so the GI Bill, in a very real way, essentially creates the middle class that the United States has today. It's government money coming from the government into the pockets of all of these men who served in World War II. Both of my grandparents, benefited enormously from this GI Bill. And what it did was it allowed that sort of working class America to move up into the middle class. So if you look at our demographics, the post-World War II era is the first time when the American middle class is going to be larger or growing into being larger than the percentage of people who live in poverty. So, today when politicians say, oh, the middle class is the backbone of the United States and this sort of, that all of that type of stuff, well, that really starts with the post-war years and with the boom. It's not the only thing that causes it, but the GI Bill is part of it. Another thing the GI Bill does is it makes people feel really secure about starting families. So we have this period that we refer to as the baby boom. No exploding babies, sorry. Only a really sharp rise in the American birth rate, so in how many babies are being born, from 1945, which is like right about here-ish, up to 1960, which is right about there. That sort of large, sharp uptick. There's a really high rate of people being born. We call them today the baby boomers, so people who were born from 1945 to 1960. So if you have like older parents, maybe they might be kind of on the young side of the baby boom generation, or if you have younger parents, your grandparents might be baby boomers. And what the baby boom is going to wind up being kind of the defining generation of the last half of the 20th century. So for the whole rest of this class, we're going to be kind of like following the baby boomers as they get older. And the 1950s, when baby boomers are young kids, is a very family-oriented decade. The 1960s, when baby boomers are becoming teenagers, is a very youth-oriented culture, right? They all become hippies and sort of, drop out of college and protest a bunch of things. In the 1980s, they're sort of entering like the work environment. That's a very business-focused decade. And right now, really, baby boomers are kind of running things and getting ready to retire, putting a lot of stress on some of our older institutions. You can think of the baby boomers as this really large generation, right? And I always kind of, the mental picture I always have is of like prey passing through a snake. You can see like the bulge in a python as it like swallows its prey. That's like the baby boom moving through our demographics. So they create this bulge wherever, at whatever age the baby boomers are, there's like a lot of people at that age. And right now they're retiring, right? They're sort of hitting retirement age. So causing some problems for us. Another thing that's going to grow sort of off the back of the GI Bill is the institution that we call suburbs. Suburb is a post-World War II institution. There really doesn't exist what we would call a suburb prior to World War II. It's something, again, that the GI Bill fuels. And the idea of a suburb is something that you can't have without cars, and that's the idea that you can commute. Right, that you don't have to live like a horse ride distance away or a walking distance away from wherever you work. So you can afford to move your family out of the city that, remember, has become increasingly crowded and diverse with the Great Migration and with all of these people moving in to take jobs of different ethnicities and different races. You can move your family out of the city and still work in the city. So you could live outside, your wife and child, can have sort of a nice little happy, quote unquote, family friendly environment to grow up in, and you can just drive in and out every day as the father, right, from your suburban home. This creates the beginnings of what sociologists refer to as white flight, or the phenomena of sort of middle-class families who can afford to and who are allowed to leaving for the suburbs, leaving behind in the inner cities an increasingly high population of poor people, obviously, and then also people of like Black and Hispanic people for the most part. I said are allowed to because a lot of suburbs, including the most famous first suburb, Levittown, which was built outside of New York City, are racially segregated. So you actually could not buy a house in Levittown if you were Black until like well into the 1960s, until the passage of several fair housing laws. So it's not just that, did you have enough money to move out of the city, but actually were you going to be able to buy a house in a suburb, because most of them were racially segregated for a long time. The suburbs are kind of cookie cutter dwellings. This is Levittown, not that long after it opened. This is kind of late 1940s, you can tell from the cars. Very creepy looking, very kind of Valley of the Dolls, right? They differentiate them a lot more now, but the suburbs are going to become a really key institution of like the late 1940s into the 1950s. Speaking of civil rights and speaking of this, the beginnings of segregation here, President Truman is really our first president that we've had or are going to have since like Lincoln, arguably, who are going to take any direct action for civil rights. So Truman actively supports anti-lynching laws. He's actively in favor of legislation against disenfranchisement. This is not something we've seen before, even from, and I'm like a big fan of FDR and all that, but even FDR never really took any sort of stand against civil rights, but Truman does. In some way. And specifically, what he really doesn't get enough credit for is this thing I have bolded at the bottom of the slide here. And this is a big deal. The College Board likes to ask about this. So in 1948, Truman is going to issue an executive order which desegregates the military. So ever since the Civil War, since we started allowing black troops into the U.S. Army officially, we have had segregated units, right? Black men fighting in one unit, white men fighting in another. 1948 desegregates and ends that. So when we come to fight the Korean War in about a year or two here, we're going to fight in integrated units for the first time. So this is a pretty big deal. It's kind of the beginnings of the civil rights. I mentioned in our last notes that World War II is kind of like a catalyst for the civil rights movement, and Truman's desegregation of the military is an early step towards that. So pretty much the same year, or actually rather the year before, the 47-48 year is the year that Jackie Robinson integrates Major League Baseball, which was a huge deal because baseball was arguably the major sport. It was baseball or boxing pretty much. So that's quite a big deal. That's in 1947. And so in the 1948 election, Truman actually, again, does something that we haven't really seen from a major candidate in a while. He's going to push for some civil rights goals, mild ones, but still civil rights goals on the Democratic Party platform. And as a result, for the first time in a long time, we see the southern states, the old sort of Confederate South, backlashing a little against the Democratic Party. Remember that they've been the solid South since since the Civil War, right, since Reconstruction. But this group that we call kind of the Dixiecrats are going to start to grumble that Truman is, getting too radical or granting too many civil rights. And so the election of 1948, which you've probably never run into before, is actually a weirdly important election in terms of the future of the Democratic Party. Here's our two central candidates here. We have Truman, who's a Democrat, and then we have Dewey over here, who is our Republican candidate. So those are our two guys. Truman, of course, is the current sitting president. Truman is facing a split in his party from Henry Wallace, who thinks that Truman is basically not progressive enough, not like liberal enough, and wants to see almost kind of a more New Deal type policy, less containment, less worried about the Cold War, more worried about domestic stuff. And then over on this side, we have usually called the Dixiecrats, but the correct name is the States' Rights Democratic Party, running a guy named Strom Thurmond, who is around forever and finally was a senator for a very long time and finally died, like, not that long ago. And their platform, as you can imagine, was just basically like anti-civil rights and pro-segregation. And so this is a really, really tight election, and every poll leading up to election night says, Thomas Dewey, that the Democrats are going to split, right, Dixiecrats and progressives, and Dewey's going to win, right? It's going to be a Republican victory, President Dewey, President Dewey, President Dewey. In fact, it's so close the night of the election that a bunch of papers go to press with the results that say that Dewey won. And then in the morning, when California and some of the West Coast states report, it's sort of at the last minute. It's a really small margin of victory for Truman. So this is a very famous picture that you may have seen before. This is Truman, and this is legitimately the only picture I've ever seen of him smiling like this. He's more kind of taciturn usually, but this is him very excited, holding up the Chicago paper that says Dewey defeats Truman, GOP, succeeds, blah, 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 and smiling because he has actually won the election. So this is our 1948 electoral map. And you'll notice these yellow states down here. Those are the states that went for that States' Rights Democratic Party, that 1948 Dixiecrat Party. This is the first time that any of those states have voted anything except Democrat since Reconstruction. So that's a pretty big deal. And we're starting to see that, Democrat coalition kind of shivering a little bit here. Truman, high on victory in 1949, comes into his second term with what he calls the Fair Deal. This is a deliberate continuation or takeoff of FDR's New Deal, which itself was a takeoff on Teddy Roosevelt's Square Deal, right? So there's some deliberate repetition there, trying to tie back to sort of liberal, progressive policies. It's basically kind of like a big government, expansion of welfare programs. It's going to get mixed support. The Republican Congress dominate Congress. It's what we call a split Congress. So there's Democrat in the White House, but Republicans dominate the the Congress, and that makes it hard to get some things done. But, the GI Bill, as we mentioned, gets passed, and Social Security is expanded a little bit. There's some things that sound familiar, like comprehensive health insurance, that doesn't go through. But it does sort of, I guess what the most important thing about the Fair Deal is it ensures that we're not going to roll back the New Deal, right? The war is over. Theoretically, we could back off a lot of the Keynesian New Deal stuff, but we don't. We kind of double down on it, and it's going to solidify the place of the New Deal in American politics. Truman's Secretary of State, a guy named Dean Acheson, and he's going to get us involved in the thing that's going to kind of define Truman's second term, and that's the Korean War. And this is where we're going to pick up in the next set of notes, which you guys should be able to shift over to either right now or when you come back together next. So we're going to pause right here for the early Cold War notes, having talked about Truman's kind of domestic stuff. We'll pick up with some of the foreign policy for Truman, foreign policy for Eisenhower, and the Korean War as a centerpiece next time.